Hello. Before we can really start to design instruction or even to evaluate the instruction that we're given, we have to begin to understand the teaching and learning process. The use of the web can positively enhance and even transform the instruction and affect students' learning. But does it do it all by itself? Does the use of the web magically create learning? I don't think so. Web projects can positively affect learning, but they have to be implemented in the proper way. This context starts with a deeper understanding of the teaching, learning, evaluation cycle. And that's what we're going to be talking about in this lecture. The use of the web as a tool throughout this process of teaching, learning, and evaluating can create powerful learning opportunities, but only if it's done correctly. The teaching learning process is based on this premise. First of all, we need to know what our students are supposed to learn. If we understand from the standards that are given to us by the university or by the school districts, by the states, then we can start to look more closely at this teaching and learning process. The next step is we must understand our students. What are their strengths? What are their challenges? What are their individual needs? Remember, when we're teaching, especially online, we're not teaching a huge group of students. We're teaching individuals with individual needs. From this, we establish goals and objectives for the course. And you probably noticed in every course that you've taken here, there is a list of learning objectives in the syllabus. Those must be designed before the instruction can be designed. We evaluate the success of the instruction by determining how well those objectives or goals of the class were met. Once we have those objectives in place, the next step is to develop a plan of instruction, which includes selecting the methods of delivery. So, we're going to be using the internet probably as our method of delivering the instruction. But what else do we need? Do we need collaborative learning? Do we need drill and practice? Do we need to have some video presentations? Lectures? Are we going to have some discovery learning? These are all examples of methods to convey the information or the content we need to convey to reach those learning objectives. After a plan is developed, we then develop a set of events or sequenced learning materials. So that media that you might want to think about including in a course might be things like blogs, videos, RSS feeds, maybe even some paper pencil activities, maybe some presentations, some research. So you can see the list of questions that need to be answered before you start to design instruction and before you begin to understand the total cycle of teaching, learning, evaluation. All of those have to be answered. Okay, so let's say that you have already decided what kind of media you're going to use in the class. The next thing you might want to ask yourself is, what kind of questions do I need to answer prior to putting my course together? You want to find out, again, as I said, what are the students' needs, and then what are the learning outcomes, and how do those two things fit together? And then during the instruction, you need to actively note what's working and what's not working. So the very first time you do a lecture, the very first time you have a quiz, those are not necessarily going to be 100% perfect. But instead, you can eventually assess what has been working and what needs changing. So you may want to ask yourselves, did the students learn what that lesson set out to present? If so, that's great. If not, what do you need to change? What do you need to improve the lesson? Are there some extra helps that the students need? Is that extra help that the entire class needs, or is it just individual students? All of these have to do with evaluating the course. I find this section to be interesting. You're going to be introduced to probably a new topic that you've never heard about in instructional design or thinking about what needs to go into a course. When we add digital technologies into the learning process, then the opportunities for students can certainly be multiplied. They get much more opportunity to create their own path through their learning if they're doing it with digital technologies. If a student is in a regular classroom and only hearing the lecture of one instructor or reading the information from one textbook, that's a pretty narrow focus. But when we add those digital technologies, wow, we expand that learning to many, many more viewpoints. This happens when we take into consideration the practices and the ideas that are presented through something that's called universal design for learning. And I'll put those words on the screen for you. The concept of universal design really started in architecture. As designers created buildings that were accessible for people with disabilities, those new design techniques helped people who didn't have disabilities. The designs of the building became more universally usable, and that's what we want our courses to be. But let's think a little bit more about universal design. If we take just one example, and that's the use of the automatic door opener, that was intended at first for people with disabilities, people in wheelchairs, or people who had trouble standing and opening the door. But how many of you have used an automatic door opener when you had your hands full of children or your hands full of packages? So you can see how universal design trickles out to a wider audience of users. In the resources this week for this module, I have given you a handout on the basic principles of universal design. And I'd like you to read over that and think about it in the field of architecture and also in the field of education. But let me give you some of those design features, the basic principles of universal design, and there's 6 of them. The first one is the design is useful and marketable to people with diverse abilities. Think about that one when you think about education. That one's easy to understand in the field of architecture. The second principle of universal design is that the design accommodates a wide range of individual preferences and abilities. Again, that one can be easily understood in the field of architecture, but if you think about education, don't we want to design education that meets a wide range of individual preferences and student abilities? Not all students come to you with the same background. I think this third principle is really, really important. And it says that the use of the design is easy to understand, regardless of the user's experience, their knowledge, their language, or their disabilities. So if you think about the automatic door opener on a building, think about how the words on there are printed. Think about information that's on the door in front of you. So that design is easy for almost any user to understand. But how do we make that happen in a classroom or in an online setting? Think about that. The fourth principle is that the design itself communicates necessary information to the user so to be understood by a diverse population of people. Okay, that again is pretty easy in architecture. If you see that big button out in front of a door, that device certainly communicates information to the user. But what kind of devices, what kind of information can we present in an online class so that the same thing is happening? The fifth principle that we need to address is that the design itself minimizes hazards or adverse consequences. Okay, think about that in architecture. We don't want to have stairways that don't have railings. We don't want to have doors that open in the wrong direction. But think about that in online education. We need to minimize the hazards. And when you think about how you might state something in a discussion, or even how the discussion question is phrased, that can cause a problem. If students don't understand exactly what they're supposed to be doing, if the instructions are not clear, that can cause a hazard in the class. Sometimes students write a sentence and another student interprets it in the wrong way. So how do we minimize those kinds of hazards or misinterpretations in online instruction? I think the last one is fairly easy to understand, both from the idea of architecture and also from education. The sixth and last principle is that the design has to be used efficiently and comfortably without a lot of fatigue. Now, you can think about that certainly in architecture. Think about elevators and escalators and how those help. But in online education, we can reduce that fatigue syndrome by breaking the course into comfortable pieces. And you'll learn later in another course in this program that that's called chunking of information. So instead of giving you all of the ideas about online instruction in one lecture, the lectures are broken down, the assignments are broken down to be a comfortable chunk for you to understand. The many tools that we have available to us today in online education, the learning management systems, the multimedia, all help us make sure that we're using universal design in the design of online classes. But if we only look at three of those design features, and I want to use those again, I've already talked about how architecture and education fit together, but let's look at just three of those for a minute. You will see how we can apply these three to educational purposes. The first one is representing information in multiple formats and media. So if we can give students many different ways to get the same information, think about how many of those universal design features we're covering. So let me say that again. Representing information in multiple medias and multiple formats. The media and the web tools that we have also helps us provide multiple pathways for students, and gives them different actions and different ways to express themselves. So instead of only having to do a written paper or make a presentation, think of all the other ways, the other pathways that you might offer students. Then consider how that might fit with the universal design. Finally, another way that we might take education and make sure that it's hitting some of those principles of universal design is to provide multiple ways to engage the students' interest and to keep them motivated. So think about the many hypermedia, multimedia, social media that can be applied. Do any of those, do all of those help with motivation within a class? As students create with web-based tools, they not only begin learning on their own pathway through the content, but they also can use that digital media to collaborate with others. And I talked a little bit about that earlier, saying that we're no longer looking at just one person's lecture, but we're trying to expand those viewpoints so that many, many different viewpoints are presented on a single level of content. So the students have an opportunity to interact with others and to verify the knowledge that they're gaining. So think about how we're suddenly able to enhance the teaching learning process by using digital media. Before you leave the class or the lecture this week, I want you to think about the web-based tools that are used in this class that you are taking. How do these allow for the, the cycle of the teaching learning process? And how do they fit in with that universal design that we talked about? You have many examples of the teaching learning process as it's been interpreted by many, many people. And that handout is also available in the resources. So look at that cycle and think about if you were designing a learning teaching cycle of your own, what might that look like?